I'm making this video to give you a little bit more information about completing your behavior change plan that's required in your final assignment in this course. I always say when I make these videos that it's important for you to know that I'm not a videographer and I'm certainly not an actress, so please try not to judge too harshly the quality of the video. If you look, I'm in Blackboard now and I've clicked on the Behavior Change Plan tab, and you have some things for reference, and then you have the link where you're going to submit your final product, and also that provides you with directions for how to complete the project. And review the rubric very carefully before you begin your project. If there are things you're not sure of, please be sure you ask me. I'm happy to set up a time to meet with you in person, to talk with you by phone. We can Skype or FaceTime if you prefer, but we can find a way to be able to ensure that you are understanding what my expectations are. When you develop your project, one of the things I'm looking for is for you to apply the information that you've learned in the course. And I particularly would call your attention to chapters 4 and 5 in your text, where they describe conducting a functional behavior assessment and creating a behavior intervention plan. I've also given you a link to one of the IRIS modules on functional behavior assessment, which I think may be very helpful to you. Several people on their quiz said they wish they knew more. That's a good place to go for additional support. So let me pull up these guidelines and let's talk about them first, and then we'll look at the rubric. So one of the things that is somewhat challenging about this project is that you're not placed in a school, or you're not really working with an individual. And so you're going to be creating sort of a simulation or a simulated plan, because it's not going to be something that you're going to be putting into place. So you're going to need to describe a student, but you can certainly use a person that you are aware of or someone you know as a model for your plan. You have a number of prompts that you need to respond to. I'm going to talk about what my expectations are with respect to those various prompts, and then we'll look at the rubric and think about how that's going to be scored. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to provide a general description of the problem and the purpose of your plan. So I want you to think about, obviously, if you're creating a behavior change plan, that means that there is a behavior that you want to either increase or decrease based on the needs of that individual person. And when I say increase, so it may be that you have a very, very quiet student who's reluctant to participate. That would be a reason to create a plan, but there you're trying to increase participation, not decrease in inappropriate behavior. I hope that makes sense to all of you. But target and think about, okay, there's a behavior that is creating limitations for this individual, and you want to be able to create a plan to address that and help them to be more successful. You're going to describe your subjects. You can use initials, you can use a pseudonym. Like I said, if you're modeling your student off of someone you know, definitely don't use their proper name. You need to include their age, their grade, their race, ethnicity, their language status. What I'm asking there is, are they an English learner, or is there another language present in the home or in the environment that you need to be aware of as you consider development of your plan? You need to list the strengths that person has, and you can list strengths more generally, but I'm certainly looking for you to list the strengths they have in terms of the behaviors in question, and then what needs they have. So remember, in special education, we always operate by first identifying the individual's strengths, because those are things that we can build on in order to address their needs. I want you to describe the setting in which the plan will be implemented. So for the vast majority of you, it will probably be in a classroom environment. So describe that classroom environment. What grades, ages does the classroom serve? What specific subject areas or content is taught there? Is it an inclusion classroom? Is it some other sort of setting where the child's needs are being met? And then for number 4, you need to think very carefully, and you need to be able to explain the target behavior. So what is the behavior that you are working to address? For this purpose, I'm going to ask that you please confine your plan to addressing one specific behavior. Often in schools, we're addressing multiple behaviors at one time. I understand that. But this project is designed so that you can practice understanding how you would collect data to be able to objectively describe a behavior and when it doesn't occur, develop an intervention plan, and then track the results of your progress. So it's critically important that you define your behavior very specifically within the context. And when I say specifically, I mean that your description of that target behavior should be sufficient so that if someone who has never met that individual could go and observe and know when that behavior is happening and when it's not. So you need to be able to describe objectively and specifically what the behavior is that you're working to address. Then you're going to talk about the baseline condition. So a baseline condition is where that behavior is or what the status of that behavior is before you do an intervention. So what is the current performance with respect to that behavior? And you have to be looking at using a numerical measure to do that. So I'll give you an example. Let's go back to, I want a child to raise their hand who's blurting out. That would be one that would be pretty easy to think about. And so one of the things that you have to do is you have to be able to track how many times are they raising their hand in a specific period of time and how many times are they blurting out. Those are observable things. Do they speak out without raising their hand? Do they raise their hand first, right? And for that, you're probably going to be doing a frequency count. You're going to be counting the number of times each of those things occur. One suggestion I have for you in collecting your baseline data is many times students will the student will behave appropriately 90% of the time. There is absolutely no way that you can measure that. One, you'd have to be tracking that student's behavior all day long. And most teachers don't have that luxury of being able to observe a student the entire day. And then you have to be able to define what is appropriate and inappropriate. And then you have to calculate the percentage of that. That's very complex. So I'm wanting you to think about, you may be observing a child during a specific period where that target behavior is an issue. Maybe there's a concern during math that's not there during language arts. Think about those kinds of things as you're thinking about this baseline. But what you're wanting to do is measure carefully over several days to be able to create a picture of exactly what that behavior looks like. Then you're going to also do an ABC analysis. So remember, you did an ABC analysis when you looked at the Super Nanny video. This one should be easier for you. One of the challenges with Super Nanny is sometimes you don't see exactly what the antecedent is. You see a behavior and you may not always see a consequence. So when we talk about an ABC chart, we're looking at describing what occurs immediately prior to that behavior. And it needs to be something you can see and observe. So sometimes students, one of the things I noticed in Super Nanny is a couple of people said, child was bored. Well, you can't really see boredom. Many times we can tell by looking at somebody if they're bored. But what was occurring? Child is sitting, staring at a wall. That I can see, right? And then there's a behavior that occurs. What did the student do? And then there's the consequence that immediately follows that behavior. So you're going to be looking at what occurs immediately before my target behavior, what is the target behavior, and then the consequence that occurs right after. I just want you to remember that doesn't have to be negative. A consequence is an event. What occurs? Maybe something positive, maybe something negative, maybe that the individual that the student is interacting with walks away. All of those are consequences. It's an event. What occurs right after that behavior? Okay? This is a critically important part of your plan because once you describe your target behavior and you measure it, then that's going to drive everything you do from that point forward. You're going to establish after that, based on the data that you have, a short-term objective, and it must be one sentence that includes a condition, a behavior, and a criteria. What do I mean by that? Well, the condition is, what are you going to provide? Or under what set of circumstances is this behavior going to occur? So let's take my wanting the child to raise their hand more often to be called on in class. And let's say that this behavior is occurring, let's say it's in a language arts class in the morning. Maybe you have a student who's very enthusiastic about what you're doing, and that's a great thing, right? You don't want to discourage their participation, but you want to encourage them raising that hand first, right? So one of the things that I want you to think about is defining that condition. So it might be given a 45-minute language arts block and a self-monitoring checklist. That could be a condition. It tells you when I'm looking at that behavior, and it also tells you what support I'm providing to the child to help address that behavior concern. So that'd be my self-monitoring checklist. The student will raise their hand before speaking. And let me restate, raise their hand and be called on before speaking 4 out of 5 times over 4 out of 5 days. Okay? So raise their hand and be acknowledged before speaking. That would be my behavior. And then my criteria, how I'm going to measure it is, they're going to do it in a ratio of 4 out of 5 times over 4 out of 5 consecutive days. So again, my condition, given a 45-minute reading block and a self-monitoring checklist, my behavior, the student will raise their hand and wait to be called on before speaking for 4 out of 5 occasions or instances over 4 out of 5 days. Please let me know if you don't understand that, because once you've established that objective, then you develop your intervention based on how you're going to support the child to be able to meet that objective. Okay? So your one of the longest sections of your plan will be your intervention. Describe in detail the intervention you would implement in an attempt to meet the objective. I want you to be sure that you refer to your book. Go use some professional journals. I've given you other resources that you could use throughout the semester. Please consult those. And I want you to reference the things that you're doing, because they should be things that have some sort of research base behind them. So I want you to describe your primary intervention, what you would do first. And then you need to describe 2 other interventions that you would put into place if the first one wasn't successful. So sometimes we try things and they don't work exactly like we planned, and then we need to think about what we would do instead, right? Lastly, you're going to describe how you're going to monitor the child's progress in light of your intervention. So at this point you're measuring, you have your baseline that measures what was the behavior like before intervention. Now you're measuring what's the behavior like after intervention. You need to describe the type of data you're collecting, the graphs that you will use, and an explanation of how you will determine whether or not the child is on track to meet that short-term objective. It is critically important that you look at what you did at baseline and that you're measuring the behavior the same way during progress monitoring, because otherwise you can't compare data collected using one instrument in one way with data collected using another instrument in another way. So the way you're measuring that behavior should be the same at baseline as it is in your progress monitoring. Okay? I want you to make sure that you are referencing the materials you're using, that you're using APA format to do that. I am trying to get back on my screen. Let's do it this way. I want you to be sure that you're referencing the materials that you're using, your textbook, your plan, any other outside references you're using. Please follow the APA guidelines for in-text citation. If you don't have an APA manual, you can go to apastyle.org, Purdue OWL, and search for their APA information. But you need to be really taking care and making sure that you're doing that well. I'm going to pause now and start a second video where I'll talk to you about the